Chapter 4 is on reproduction, with Lesson 1 being about sexual reproduction and meiosis. And so Part 1, we're just covering the sexual reproduction part in Lesson 1, and then in Part 2 we'll talk about the meiosis and why it's important and how it's connected to the sexual reproduction. And then Lesson 2 we'll get into the asexual reproduction. The big idea is, why do living things reproduce? So think about why God made reproduction. The key concept in this PowerPoint will be, what is sexual reproduction and why is it beneficial? And then in Part 2 we're going to look at what is the order of the phases of meiosis and what happens during each phase and why is it important. Sexual reproduction, the definition you need to know is it's a type of reproduction in which the genetic materials from two different cells combine, producing an offspring. Or you could say producing, if it's a human, an individual. The genetic materials is the DNA, the chromosomes, with the genes that make up the chromosomes. In order to have sexual reproduction, we have to have the two cells that are joining that we just talked about. Those cells are collectively called gametes. So gametes are reproductive cells, or your book refers to them as sex cells. The book does not call them gametes, but that's what they are. We're going to learn when we look at Part 2 that what makes, or the process that makes these reproductive cells, is meiosis. And in most organisms, meiosis produces one of two types of gametes. Or remember, a gamete is a reproductive cell. It's a sex cell. So when you think of the sex cells, the reproductive cells, what two types do we have? We have ova and sperm. Ovum is singular, ova is plural. Those are the female gametes, the female sex cells. Remember that your book calls them eggs, and technically they're not an egg. I don't like that term. So know them as ova or ovum. So that's the female gamete. The male gamete, or the male reproductive cell, the male sex cell, is called sperm. And that's both plural and singular. Here's a picture showing you several sperm and an ovum. And you can see that there are differences. There's differences in size. The ovum is usually quite larger than the sperm. The ovum does not have any device or any kind of part to make it motile, whereas the sperm has a flagellum which allows it to swim. And those are some of the key differences you usually see in the two different types of gametes. Now, where are gametes formed? Well, if they're reproductive cells, then they are formed in reproductive organs. So sex cells, reproductive cells, gametes, are made in the reproductive organs. And back to the male and female. In the male, the reproductive organs are called testis singular or testes plural. In the female, ovaries plural or ovary singular. So in the testes, that's where sperm are made. In the ovaries, that's where ova are produced. So the female sex cell, an ovum, forms in an ovary. The male sex cell, a sperm, forms in the testis. So now we're going to talk about fertilization, which is a review. We mentioned it in the last chapter, but fertilization is when two of these gametes unite. So the process of when a sperm and an ovum join together, that process is called fertilization. The end result of fertilization is the zygote. So another way of defining it is the formation of a zygote from the union of two gametes, or the process when a sperm and an ovum joins. And you can see in this animation here that when the sperm unites with the ovum, the drastic changes start taking place. And one is, you can see the little blue material, that is the DNA. That's the genetic material mixing with the DNA in the ovum. And then it will change into 2 cells and into 4 cells by the process that we looked at in the last chapter, which is mitosis, until cell differentiation occurs. So what is sexual reproduction? Well, sexual reproduction involves 2 gametes. Usually they're called a sperm and an ovum. When they unite, that process of uniting is called fertilization. Remember, biblically they refer to it as being conceived or conception. So during the process called fertilization, an ovum cell and a sperm cell join together to create the zygote. And remember, that's the one cell that we all began as. And you can see here the male cat provides the sperm, the female cat provides the ovum. When the sperm unites with the ovum, it produces the zygote, which is now going to become that new kitty cat, that new organism, that new individual. Here's what a zygote looks like, and the definition of a zygote is the new cell, or the cell that forms from fertilization. It is referred to as a zygote. And anything that, or any multicellular organism, it began as a zygote. Now we're going to get into 2 new terms that we've not used before, and that's the terms diploid and haploid. Diploid and haploid have to do with the chromosome number inside of a cell nucleus. So organisms that reproduce sexually form 2 kinds of cells. Most of the cells that are formed are what make up the body of that organism. Your book simply refers to it as body cells. Technically, the science name for them are somatic cells. And then other cells that have to be produced are the reproductive cells that we just talked about in the testes and in the ovaries, and that is the sperm and the ova. They are, remember, called gametes. They're sex cells, they're reproductive cells. But another name that they have, the opposite of body cells or somatic, is germ. So in an organism that reproduces sexually, the organism is mainly going to be body cells called somatic cells, or they're going to be the reproductive cells, which are referred to as germ cells. In somatic cells of most organisms, similar chromosomes occur in pairs. And remember, in that pair, one came from the mom, one came from the dad. And if we're talking about a human, that would be 23 chromosomes coming from the mom, 23 from the dad, and making 23 pairs of these similar chromosomes. Diploid cells are cells that have pairs of chromosomes, and that's what our somatic cells are. Our somatic cells, if you looked inside a human being, every nucleus inside a somatic cell would have 23 pairs of chromosomes. It has 46 chromosomes, but there's 23 pairs because 23 chromosomes came from mom, 23 from dad. So that 46 that is made by these 23 pairs, that is referred to as the diploid cell, or the diploid number. Here's an example showing you 3 different examples of a diploid cell. I like the one on the right there showing you that some are coming, the half are coming from mom and half are coming from dad. Diploid cells, when you have a pair of chromosomes that have genes for the same traits arranged in the same order, They are called homologous chromosomes. Homologous chromosomes. Homo means same. And what this means is, when you look at one pair of chromosomes that came, half of the pair, one chromosome from mom, one chromosome from dad, that means if the top gene was for hair color, so it is on both of them. But it might not be the same hair color, because your dad may have given you a gene for brown hair and your mom may have given you a gene for red hair. So they're similar because they're dealing with hair color, but they're not exact. So they're not the same thing as a sister chromatid, because that's where one chromosome produces an exact copy of itself. These are not exact copies. If the second gene is for what type of nose you have, then the second gene on the mom and the dad would both be for what type of nose. They both could be for the same type of nose, or they could have different genes, but they're for the shape of your nose. That's what is meant by homologous chromosomes. Because one chromosome is inherited from each parent, the chromosomes are not identical. They are not sister chromatids. Different organisms have different number of chromosomes. I've got a few examples. We just talked about what a human is. All right, here's a picture, or actually an illustration, of homologous chromosomes. Now, if you look at on the left there of the larger chromosomes, you see an exact copy. That's a sister chromatid. That would be like the sister chromatid from mom. And then on the right-hand side, where you have the purple band at the top and the green second, and then the brown, which is a centromere, and then the red, yellow, green, and red, that would be a sister chromatid from dad. And so you get a homologous pair of chromosomes, where if you look at the first allele, which are where the genes are located, they're basically like genes, you have one is light blue and one is purple. That's showing you that it's different. In other words, one could be for, you can roll your tongue, maybe that's the light blue, and then the purple would be you cannot roll your tongue. And then you go down to the next, and they both have green. So let's say that's for eye color. So let's say both parents have an allele, a gene for green eye color. But you go down to the next one, they have identical genes as well, but you look at the next pair, they don't. So they are not exact, but they're dealing with the same traits in the exact same order. Now here's how they differ. Look at some examples. In a fruit fly, the number of chromosomes are 8. Well, half came from mom, half came from dad. So that means there's 4 homologous pairs of chromosomes. Rice, and I don't want you to just think this is in animals. There's some good examples here of rice, which is from the plant kingdom, and then yeast, which is a fungus. That's, well, it's not a fungus, but it's in kingdom fungi. With rice, you have 24 chromosomes, therefore 12 from the female, 12 from the male, so that gives you 12 pairs of homologous chromosomes. Yeast, 32 and 16. A cat, 38 and 19. Human, as we talked about, 46 and 23. A dog, 78 and 39. And don't think that just because of size, the greater the size, the more chromosomes. That's not true. The most that we know of is a particular type of fern, and in each nucleus they have 1,260 chromosomes, which is 630 homologous pairs. Now haploid is half. It's reduced by half. So if a cell is diploid is 46, like in a human, what are the haploid? Well, they have half the number of chromosomes. They only have 1 out of the homologous pair. And so they're called haploid. So haploid cells are cells that have only 1 chromosome from each of the pairs of chromosomes, each of the homologous pairs of chromosomes. And the word comes from single, meaning you're getting one chromosome out of the pair instead of both. Now you think, why do we need to have haploid cells? Well, think about reproduction, and we're going to talk about why we need diploid cells. See, body cells, your somatic cells, are diploid. What are haploid? Your reproductive cells. So look at the difference of haploid versus diploid. In haploid, you have one of the chromosome out of the homologous pair. So it could either be the one from mom or the one from dad. And if you have the whole, both one from mom and one from dad, you have a diploid chromosome, which is diploid number. Normal human cells, the somatic cells, the body cells, have 23 pairs of chromosomes, which is a total of 46 chromosomes. So the human diploid number is 46, and the human haploid number is 23. And here's some examples of diploid and haploid. How can you find one if you know the other? Well, look, haploid means half of what diploid is. Di means 2. So if you're given a haploid number, to find the diploid, you just multiply by 2. 16 times 2, 100 by 2, 22 by 2, 11 by 2, 10 by 2. Or vice versa, if you're giving the diploid number and you want to find the haploid, you take half of it. So you divide by 2. 32 divided by 2 is 16. 200 divided by 2 is 100. 44 divided by 2 is 22, and so on. So and again, the key is, what are these cells? Diploid cells are the somatic cells, the body cells. Haploid cells are the gametes, the reproductive cells, the sex cells. And we're going to see how those haploid cells are made from a diploid cell in the next lesson, which is on meiosis, the process of meiosis.